Larian Studios' Divinity Original Sin seemed to strike a winning formula. Its turn-based combat system gave players lots of tools to play around with while feeling deep enough to be tactically engaging. The level of interactivity of the world was something rarely seen in an RPG, and the addition of Co-op did a lot to broaden the game's appeal. Divinity Original Sin 2 set to build on this foundation. A conscious effort was made to remedy the first game's shortcomings, particularly the weak narrative, as well as to up the overall level of presentation. It added new races, new abilities, new skills, new status effects. Community feedback was taken on board both from the first game and from Original Sin 2's early access release, and so Divinity Original Sin 2 seemed like the perfect sequel, and many reviews suggested it was. It received a 93 on Metacritic, GameSpot gave it a 10 out of 10, and PC Gamer named it their Game of the Year. Its universal critical acclaim was matched by very strong sales, with 1 million copies being sold within 2 months, a feat most CRPGs can only dream of. But Divinity Original Sin 2's success put it beyond the realm of other CRPGs. It wasn't just a game for old school RPG fans. It didn't have to rely on pandering to nostalgia or standing on the shoulders of previous classics like Planescape Torment or Fallout. It was a true mainstream success that would be played and enjoyed by people who had never touched an isometric RPG before in their lives. And that's great. Larian have truly made a name for themselves, and Divinity Original Sin 2 is a good game, just like Divinity Original Sin 1 was. Still, it's not the perfect sequel because despite many improvements, it also has worse combat than the first game and makes a few other important missteps. But what's perhaps most interesting about Original Sin 2 is that many of the mistakes it does make are a direct result of trying to address the criticisms of the first game. Each misstep was made with good intent. So let's start at what is likely the most obvious example of this: armor. RNG can be frustrating, and many players don't like seeing their abilities miss an enemy as a result of a saving throw not going their way. If that enemy is a boss, and if that saving throw can turn the tide of the battle, this is a real problem as it diminishes the feeling of skill. People want to win because of their strategy, not because of their luck, and this could happen in Original Sin 1. In addition to this, some criticise the first game as being overly reliant on crowd control, as well as expressing frustration at being crowd controlled by the enemy so regularly, sometimes before they even had a chance to control their characters in combat. So along comes Original Sin 2 and the addition of armor, which creates 2 additional sets of hit points, one depleted by physical damage, the other by magic damage, that have to be removed before that character can be affected by most negative statuses. And so this replaced the need for saving throws. No longer would players have to suffer from a bad roll of the dice from their skills being resisted, or be able to rely on crowd control to lock down the battlefield so easily. On paper it seemed like a great change, but it had a number of other consequences. Firstly, it greatly diminishes one of the most fun parts of Original Sin 1, environmental effects and the mayhem that came with them. Before, the right combination of effects could completely change how the fight plays out. Electrified puddles could lock down multiple opponents, combining fire and poison could result in large amounts of damage, and areas of ice or oil could provide a vital safety barrier to protect your vulnerable party members. Now, a lot of the CC effects from environmental hazards are resisted by armor and so can be completely ignored. Walking through a field of fire might have meant certain death before, but now it only does damage to your magic armor, which can often be shrugged off. Things like elemental arrows and grenades felt incredibly useful in Original Sin 1 as they could be used as combo pieces, but now setting up the right combination of effects is almost always less effective than spending your action points on pure damage. Environmental effects were one of the real selling points of Original Sin 1, and while they still exist, they just don't matter very much anymore. This is really obvious when you look at most traps, which are now pretty much completely neutered. Seriously, almost every single trap in the game can just be ran across and ignored, and while this could have been easily fixed by just increasing the damage traps do, it wasn't, which makes traps a complete joke. There's also the addition of cursed effects, which make controlling the environment even more difficult as the only way to effectively get rid of them is using the skill Bless, which costs 1 action point plus 1 source point plus 1 memory slot, and is therefore rarely worth its high cost. And if that alone wasn't enough to make environmental effects feel unimportant, Larian have also added several new mobility skills, both for you and your enemies, meaning most characters can just jump around the battlefield whenever they want to anyway. Getting Cloak and Dagger or Phoenix Dive on your marksman in Original Sin 1 took serious investment into their respective skill sets, but they can be acquired far easier in Original Sin 2. Anyway, we'll come back to skills later, but for now let's get back to the effects of armor. Just as in Original Sin 1 where crowd control was king, now high damage has taken its place, because bursting down characters' armor is what allows you to CC them. This may not sound like a bad change, but in Original Sin 1 there was always lots of ways to CC enemies, and different enemies had different resistances to encourage you to not just rely on the same methods over and over. In comparison, when your objective is to do as much damage as possible, it's usually pretty easy to work out what is objectively the best way to do this. And when you've done enough damage to break the enemy's shield, you'll probably rely on the same few CC abilities because some are much easier to use than others. For example, whenever I remove an enemy's physical armor, I use either Battering Ram, Battle Stomp, or a Knockdown arrow, because Knockdown is better than other types of CC. I could use Cripple, Blind, or Atrophy, but these don't always reliably stop enemies from attacking you. And magic is similar. I relied on the same few ways of sleeping and charming my opponents, because that's what worked best with my setup. In Original Sin 1, I'd often use stuns and freezes as well, but in Original Sin 2 you have to remove an enemy's magic armor and then chill or shock an enemy twice to CC them, so unless your main source of magic damage does these effects anyway, they're just not worth using. You probably had a different setup to me and so relied on different tactics, but my point is, whatever worked for you probably worked just as well across most fights, because fights play out too similarly now. You can usually just use the same combination of skills to maximize damage and then use the same few CC abilities. In Original Sin 1, experimentation was more rewarding, and different fights would more often require different strategies. There were times in each game where I'd lose a fight and try again. In Original Sin 1, I'd often try something completely different, and that would often work and things would play out in ways I wouldn't expect. In Original Sin 2, I'd just do 95% of things similarly, except try to squeeze out a little bit more DPS, usually through using things like Adrenaline or Time Warp, because experimentation is just not as rewarding when all that matters is doing enough damage to break armor, and the only big choice that most fights present is deciding which opponents to focus down first. In contrast, Original Sin 1 often felt like this great interplay between chaos and control. Manipulating the environment could be very effective, but things didn't always go the way you want. Combinations of effects could spiral out of control, and enemies would also be using abilities, meaning things wouldn't always go the way you want them to. In addition to this, different elemental resistances, as well as different bodybuilding and willpower stats, meant the effectiveness of different strategies would vary from fight to fight, and so there was an actual need to mix things up. Still, with all that said, this doesn't mean the combat is bad in Original Sin 2. It's not as good as Original Sin 1, but it's still better than most games. Experimentation is not as rewarding as in Original Sin 1, but you still have a large number of tools to play with, and there is still room for experimentation. Environmental effects are nowhere near as impactful as Original Sin 1, but they still have some impact, and hey, they do look pretty nice now at least. The changes brought about by armor are the root cause of a lot of these problems, and even if a reduction in RNG it's brought may seem good, it doesn't seem worth it overall. But the fact that mobility has been increased and environmental effects have also had their damage decreased doesn't help. Same with cursed effects, which are too difficult to counteract. Combat design should encourage players to interact with the environment, not ignore it. Often it feels like every fight just ends up with necrofire everywhere while you do your best to pretend it doesn't exist. Outside of armor, the initiative system has also changed for the worse. Party members and enemies are now forced to take turns alternatively, so your party members' initiative only matters relative to each other, making initiative a completely useless stat now, and I have no idea why this was changed. Something else that's different is how fights start. Before, you could easily see enemies standing around, and the player would be the one to initiate the fight. Now, most fights either start through conversations or through the player being ambushed. This isn't necessarily a change for the worse. Towards the end of the first game, you could ambush enemies using your high AP skills, and doing this was way too effective. Also, having enemies standing around the map just waiting for the player to come and kill them is a bit weird if you actually think about it, and the removal of this isn't something I have a problem with. However, when enemies were visible before combat, you could see exactly what level they were, and you also had a chance to save the game before starting combat. With ambushes, you can't see if enemies are too high level for you, and you get no chance to save beforehand. This means you can end up in fights with enemies way over your level where you have no chance of victory, and you may also find that it's been a while since you last saved, and losing your progress due to getting ambushed by an unbeatable foe feels very unfair. There's a particularly egregious example of this in Arcs, where the player can get ambushed in several locations by a group of level 20 demons. You'll probably explore Arcs when you first get there, at which point you're likely only level 18, and you will get completely destroyed by these foes. These enemies are also very hard to avoid, and because you're in a usually safe area, there's a good chance you haven't been quick saving regularly, and so will lose a lot of progress when they kill you. This is very annoying, and it can happen more than once in different areas of the city. Anyway, if the game is going to feature ambushes, it would be really nice if it would autosave just before the ambush is triggered, rather than just after. But for all this complaining, there are some parts of combat that have been improved with the Enhanced Edition and aren't as much of a problem as they were at release. Like AI. Before, enemies would often move around with no regards to attacks of opportunity, but that doesn't seem to happen as much anymore. There is one big problem with the AI that persists though, which is that enemies that are far away just seem to do nothing and skip their turns. But at least this doesn't happen in most encounters. Another thing improved by the Definitive Edition is the balance between magic and physical armor. Before, a lot of enemies had very similar values, which encouraged players to stack one type of damage. It was also the case that physical damage was overall better than magical, and so stacking physical proved the best strategy. Now, physical damage is less effective and armor is better balanced to incentivize taking a mix of attack types. You can still use one damage type, and the armor system encourages this in a lot of ways, but at least now you don't feel like you're being punished for not doing this. Another thing improved is the difficulty curve. Original Sin 1 plus the Enhanced Edition and Original Sin 2 Base Edition all had the same problem. If you did most side quests, you'd start to out-level enemies, and that meant the late game was too easy even on Tactician. Now, finally, with the Enhanced Edition of Original Sin 2, the game stays consistently challenging for its duration, and Tactician difficulty feels like it's in a good place to provide a challenge for experienced players. But despite the fact that difficulty no longer falls off partway through, combat can still feel a bit repetitive in the later acts. Even ignoring the impact of armor, there's still the same problem that Original Sin 1 had, which is that there just aren't many interesting late game abilities. Around halfway through Act 2 you'll be able to get all the skills you want, with the only exceptions being maybe a couple of source abilities you haven't found the skill books for. The problem is, there's still another 40 to 50 hours left after this, and the fact that your skills remain pretty similar through the remainder of the game just takes some of the excitement out of the late game. Some fights can also feel like they drag on, thanks to combat animation still being so slow. This can be really noticeable when you fight alongside allies or participate in three-way fights, where you have to wait for twice the normal number of NPCs to take their turn. Another good example is the oil field fight in Act 2, where there's a large number of enemies which also heal each other, and the fight just drags on as you sit there waiting for all these damn elemental blobs to finally die. If it didn't take so long, and if the allied NPC wasn't so suicidal, this would be an interesting fight. The large amount of oil encourages you to set everything ablaze, and then fire ads start turning up to shake things up. Your starting position encourages you to take an unusually defensive approach as you try to hold the high ground against waves of enemies. So the concept behind this fight is nice, and it's clear that effort has been made to try to make encounters feel unique in general, with none of them really feeling like they exist just for the sake of padding. So it's all the more disappointing that despite the differences between encounters, this rarely translates into players needing different strategies. But enough about combat. What about the other parts of the game? Well, before moving on to the things that Original Sin 2 actually improves upon, there are still a couple more things it fucks up. Namely, the leveling system and itemization. Let's start with the ability system. The new ability trees of Summoner and Polymorph are great additions, with each feeling like they're designed with versatility in mind so they work well with the multi-classing playstyle the series encourages. The problem comes with how abilities level up. In Original Sin 1, each rank of an ability was more expensive than the last. This gave players an incentive to level up a range of abilities, as investing a few points into different things was cheap. However, higher ranks of each ability were also rewarding, as these unlock the best skills while also giving you more skill slots. This meant players had to consider carefully what to put points into, as each rank of an ability unlocked something new, and there was lots of different ways you could build a character and still feel viable. In Original Sin 2, most skills only require a very small number of points invested to use them, usually just 1 or 2 points. Abilities also cost a flat amount now, and rather than unlocking new skills and skill slots, they instead each give their own bonus, which for almost every ability is a flat 5% damage increase to certain skills. This is already less interesting, but different abilities are also objectively worse than others, which removes any element of choice. For example, if you have a physical damage dealing ranged character, Huntsman gives 5% bonus to damage when you're on high ground. Warfare, however, gives a 5% damage bonus to all physical damage. So Huntsman gives 5% damage sometimes, and Warfare gives 5% damage all of the time. Therefore, there's no reason to choose Huntsman over Warfare, and so on level up there's no choice involved. Just put all your points into Ranged and Warfare and ignore everything else, except for putting those 1 or 2 points into whatever you want to use some extra skills from. This is boring, and things are the same for magic characters. Say you want to use a damage dealing Pyro/Geomancer. Well, Pyro gives 5% fire damage, while Geo gives 5% to earth and poison. So it makes sense to pick only one of these and focus on investing points into that first, because if you have 50% damage increase to one type of magic, you can just rely on using that one type of magic for damage, which is more effective than having 25% damage increase for 2 different types. Later on, you can at least invest 10 points into 2 different magic types, but there's no way to effectively make a hybrid magic character that uses more than 2 types of magic offensively, as your damage will be suboptimal. And with the new armor system, damage is king. Civil abilities are now a separate thing to combat abilities, and this is good as it means they no longer need to be balanced against combat abilities. However, much like combat abilities, the choice of what to level up feels incredibly straightforward. You can make each character specialise in one thing, and so you can have one character focused on each of the important civil abilities, Persuasion, Lawmaster and Thievery, with one character left over for whatever else you want. This means you can pass every single speech check, unlock every chest, and identify every item you find, and all of these things feel boring when you know you haven't had to sacrifice anything to get them. Playing a character with high persuasion can be a fun thing in an RPG, when you know you had to invest a lot into the skill to unlock new speech options, but when getting a high level of persuasion is so easy to do, it robs it of all satisfaction. Presumably, combat and civil abilities were changed to be easier to understand to benefit new players, but I don't think this has happened. Choosing what to level up is straightforward only if you understand the game, but for new players things are just as confusing as ever. Maybe even more so, as there are now even more options to choose from. The leveling system hasn't been made easier to learn, it's just simpler once you've already learnt it. And while we're talking about leveling, there's also too much stat inflation between levels. This forces players to take an almost completely linear route through the game, as enemies just 1 or 2 levels higher than the player can feel unbeatable. What's worse is how this affects loot. Just as in Original Sin 1, item drops are frequent. However, now the stat difference between items 1 level apart is much larger. This was likely because players complained loot was boring in Original Sin 1, but the changes mean players are now forced to upgrade gear constantly, to the point where no piece of loot ever feels special or rewarding to get, because the player always knows that in just 1 level this item will be suboptimal. This is very noticeable on weapons, where an increase of just 1 level can increase damage by more than 20%. What's more, vendors restock their available equipment every time you level up, so players are incentivized to constantly head back to vendors to buy new gear and keep up with the stat inflation. Loot is still almost completely random as well. meaning there are few items with genuinely interesting effects. But perhaps the single most annoying thing about loot is that when you're given a choice of items to receive as a quest reward, something which happens all the time, you have no way to compare these items to what your other party members are currently using. Considering how many times you upgrade your gear, it is near impossible to actually remember what you have equipped, and if you try to reload a save, check your gear, and hand the quest in again, the random loot means you'll have completely different rewards to choose from, meaning the problem just repeats. Seriously, for such a small thing, this happens all the time, and it's infuriating. But while there are lots of things Original Sin 2 does worse than its predecessor, there are plenty of things it still does really well. Co-op still works great. I'm not sure what happened to the whole play competitively thing that was a big part of the original Kickstarter pitch.
The really unique thing is that you can play cooperatively and competitively. When playing competitively, you'll engage in competitive questing and the other players will essentially be role-playing your antagonists.
Then again, I suppose being overly ambitious and promising more than you can deliver is just part of the norm for Kickstarter projects, so I guess we should just forget about it? But something not forgotten about is voice acting. Full voice acting returns from Original Sin 1 Enhanced Edition, and while I still regularly read ahead and skipped large parts of the voice acting as a result, it's still hard to deny that the voice acting has a lot of personality, and the narrator in particular does a really great job. The open-ended design to quests also returns. At some times it's far more open-ended than others, but it's still far better than most RPGs at giving you a range of ways to complete quests, and the escape from Fort Joy section in particular stands out. You can fight your way through the front gate, get arrested and break out of jail, use teleportation gloves to either sneak into the upper level or into the prison section, find a hidden tunnel through completing one side quest, or find a hidden hatch by the Statue of the Divine through a different side quest. Once you are inside, you again have plenty of ways to get out, and having the freedom to find your own way in and out of the fort feels pretty good. The quest design in general rarely holds the player's hand, although there are map markers now. Before the Enhanced Edition, the journal was terrible, and so map markers felt needed at times, but now the journal works well, making map markers often feel a bit unnecessary. Still, when you consider that playing co-op can make following quest directions more difficult, as players are more likely to be distracted or to skip through text, the addition of map markers seems to make sense, and there are still plenty of quests which do require players to actually read and understand the directions they're given. Original Sin 2 is still not a game that holds the player's hand very closely, and there are still lots of hidden areas and quests to find to reward players for exploring and thinking for themselves. So the addition of map markers to make the game a bit more accessible doesn't feel like it comes at the cost of Larian's open-ended design philosophy. The soundtrack is again great. The different arrangements of some pieces that use different instruments really show how much effort Larian put into the little parts of the game's presentation. And the same can be said for the graphics, which look great overall and also show an impressive commitment to detail at times, like with all the racial variations for the player's armour. So I guess all that's left is to talk about the story, and outside of presentation, story is the other clear area of improvement over the first game. This was apparently a big priority for Larian, and it seems fair to say that Original Sin 2 feels a lot more interesting and less generic than its predecessor. Despite that, the story doesn't seem to have much thematic depth to it, and a few other problems also undermine the strength of the narrative. But before getting into that, be aware that the next section will contain spoilers for the game's ending and for some companions. If you want to avoid any spoilers, check the video description for a timestamp to skip ahead. With that said, let's talk about Source. From the game's opening, the dynamic of being a prisoner held captive gives players a reason to be initially invested in the story. By making Source collars actual objects, which take up an equipment slot, this part of the narrative is reinforced by the gameplay. This works particularly well if the player finds an amulet that they can't equip, because they still have their Source collar wasting their neck slot, and the fact that you can see each character's Source abilities but can't actually use them also adds to this. As Source is the main focus of the story, the fact that it has real gameplay consequences is good. In Act 2, the Magister's dogs will try to sniff you out, potentially forcing you into a fight with guards, and using Source abilities near Magisters will cause them to attack you. As you meet other sorcerers and get more powerful in the story, you unlock new source abilities and gain access to more powerful skills. And when these sorcerers grant you more power, you often see where this power comes from. One sorcerer takes the power from the surrounding wildlife, removing the pet pal ability if you have it. Rika consumes the souls of those buried in the graveyard. Jahan harnesses the power of the captive demon, and so on. It's great that the story provides context to where your powers come from, and that there is a feeling of narrative consequence to your growth. So there's interesting things about how Source is handled. However, in a world with magic, what is the point in Source? How is Source different to magic? I don't mean what is the lore difference, I mean what is the practical difference. Magic already allows you to heal the wounded from the brink of death, or conjure fireballs and thunderstorms out of thin air. And magic is pretty ubiquitous in this world. So what does Source do that makes it so important? Allow you to summon slightly bigger fireballs and flashier thunderstorms? This is a story that's all about the role of Source, but for all intents and purposes, Source is no different to magic, and knowing that undermines the role Source is meant to play. At the end of the game, the final decision is to decide what to do with Source. Keep its power for yourself, give it to the people so the power is shared evenly, or remove it completely so no one will ever use it again. And it's hard to have a strong opinion either way, as Source doesn't seem all that important. Over the course of the game, the player grows in power far more from gaining experience points and better loot than from gaining Source powers. And you could ignore Source abilities completely and finish the game just as easily, except for maybe a few out-of-combat examples. So the role that Source is meant to play in the story, and in creating a meaningful choice at the end of the game, just feels a bit hollow when Source is so similar to magic. The other main theme running through the story is divinity, but this feels like a topic that the game doesn't have anything to actually say about. Through the story you meet several important NPCs. Individually they feel like interesting enough characters, although there are far too many important NPCs which seem similar, and the fact that so many of them don't want to tell the player much about what's going on or what their motives are is a bit annoying. Still, while some of these characters are interesting individually, none of them seem to represent anything meaningful. Dallas and Lucian have good intentions but follow an ends justify the means approach that's pretty questionable. The God King has bad intentions but an understandable motive of restoring his former place in the world. The gods are out for themselves and don't end up playing a very significant role. The Doctor just wants to be powerful, and Brachus Rex exists just so players have someone to fight for an end boss regardless of who they side with. And none of these characters represent any interesting ideals or ideologies. I'm not saying the game needs to commit to having some deep or pretentious message, but it could do with feeling like its central conflicts had a little more substance to them. The 6 origin characters are pretty good though. The regular interactions they have with the people they know is interesting, and their backstories feel very fleshed out. They're far better than the companions in Original Sin 1. However, playing as an origin character can feel like it detracts from the role-playing side of the game. It's hard not to feel like each origin character is their own character and is therefore not your character. Of course, you can create and play as a custom character, but doing this makes you feel like you don't get as much of a story as a full origin party does. Perhaps I'm alone in this, and I don't want to criticise Larian for something that is ultimately the player's choice, but the completionist side of me wants to play as an origin character for more story, while the RPG fan in me wants to play as a custom character so that it actually feels like my character, and whichever I choose it ultimately makes me feel like I'm missing out. You also don't get much sense of an origin character's personality if you do play as them, but each origin character has unique scenes that you only see by playing as them, so to really appreciate their stories it almost feels like you need to experience both playing as them and playing with them to see both their personality and their full story. This is a bit weird, but it does have the advantage of adding replayability, and for characters like Thane and Losa, getting to see certain moments from their point of view can be really interesting. Also, while the origin characters are individually quite good, they don't interact with each other very much. There's almost no comments made from one party member to another. It also doesn't make much sense why the main character is the party leader. You end up with the chance to be the sole person to ascend to divinity, despite the fact that your party members have just as legitimate a claim to this role as you. Your party members follow you almost unquestionably, even if you do things they don't like. And there's almost no narrative justification for why this is, except that in the tutorial you help people escape, and I guess that's all it takes. Really, you have no better claim to leadership or godhood than any of them, but yet they still seem to worship the ground you walk on for no apparent reason. And finally, I want to talk about one of the narrative's biggest problems: tone. Apparently, people complained that Original Sin 1 was too whimsical and focused on humour. So Larian's answer to that was to inject more darkness into Original Sin 2's story. At the same time, Larian also hired quite a few new writers, meaning several different people worked on the story, and as with many projects with several writers, there's always a big challenge to maintain a consistent voice, and Original Sin 2 often fails at this. And when the game switches back and forth between silly humour and grim dark edginess, the clash in tone can be pretty jarring. Let me show you a couple of examples. You have moments like this.
Well, don't you look like hell? Swallowed something that doesn't agree with you? Tell me, was it a demon's nice, big pecker?
And then you have scenes like this.
Wet eyes, red face, soiled garb. The dwarf suffering is writ on his body and soul. He opens his mouth to speak, revealing a gaping darkness where his tongue should be. You recognize him. This is Barston Tongues. His lips part. Drool trickles from his lower lip, but he speaks no words, and there is no meaning to be found in his formless throat burbles. The dwarf's agony is evident in his wrecked face and figure, but he cannot speak of it. He has only a minuscule flesh stump in place of a tongue.
Which is honestly a bit disturbing. And I'm not highlighting this scene to say the writing's bad, it's not, it's good, it's effective, but it also feels out of place. It's hard to understand how this game wants you to feel. At times it feels like you're on a whimsical, light-hearted adventure where the writing is focused mostly on having fun. At other times, this game is bleak and almost gleeful in how much suffering it can inflict on the world's inhabitants, and the grim dark elements are everywhere. You have chemical weapons of mass destruction in the form of death fog, bodily horrors being inflicted on innocents through turning them into silent monks, geists, and shriekers. You even meet shriekers in the process of turning where they're crying out in agony. You have animals asking to be mercy killed and demons harnessing the suffering of children and mass graves of emaciated corpses littering the street of Ark, and fuck, it's all a little much. Generally, I'm someone who will happily defend grim dark elements in fiction, but in Original Sin 2, the speed at which you can go from laughing at something a silly animal says to hearing detailed accounts of someone's prolonged suffering is just too sudden, and it can leave the player not being sure how to react. And sometimes it can be hard to take serious moments seriously because there are times where the writing seems like it doesn't want you to take it seriously. Still, there are some serious moments that work well. One that really stands out is towards the end of Losa's questline, where you go to the Doctor's personal realm to try to weaken him. There you find some candles that represent the souls he's made a deal with and draws power from. To weaken him, you must extinguish the candles, but doing so kills the person whose soul the candle represents. The first candle you find belongs to an NPC you've met who isn't a very good person. Therefore, it's easy to justify extinguishing it. The next candles you find come in a pair, where one person seems bad and one good, and so it's harder to justify blowing them out. It feels like a real moral choice. Malady pushes you to extinguish them and her logic is sound. It's not too hard to justify your actions, to accept that one innocent will have to suffer to defeat an evil which causes much greater suffering. And then you move forward, and instead of seeing 1 or 2 candles, you see thousands, stretching out as far as the eye can see. And it's a perfect, oh shit moment. If you struggled with, but ultimately decided to kill one innocent soul before this, then this moment completely recontextualizes your past dilemma. Your previous excuse of, hey, it's just one soul, has been completely taken from you, and if you decide to blow the candles out, you're really made to feel the weight of your actions. This is a great moment, it's great storytelling. And this is a dark, serious moment. But unlike some of the other dark parts of the game, it's not thrown at you out of the blue. It's built up slowly and carefully, and it also serves a clear purpose in the narrative. While other moments feel like they only exist to meet some edginess quota that was put in place after too many people criticised Original Sin 1 for being too silly. And that brings me back to the point I made at the beginning of this video. You can criticise Larian for many things, but you can't say they didn't try to make the best sequel they could. They tried to learn from Original Sin 1, they tried to learn from the feedback they received, and in some areas, like story, characters and presentation, they were thoroughly successful. Whereas with others, like combat, loot and the leveling system, their genuine attempt to improve on the original may have led them in the wrong direction. But if that is the case, then these mistakes were made for the right reason. It's easy to say don't fix what isn't broken, but I'm not sure if that's an ideal I can get behind. I'd rather see a series try to continually improve, even when there's a chance of failure, and even for parts that seem like they don't need improvement. And even if Original Sin 2 makes some missteps, at least it didn't compromise its core vision of player freedom. Despite the game's great commercial success, it's not a result of Larian selling out. Divinity Original Sin 2 is still a great mix of new and old, but tries to keep the spirit of pen and paper alive. And personally, I'm very interested to see where Larian will go from here, and to see what feedback they'll try to implement in their next game. Hopefully, there will be fewer steps backwards, but I hope they follow the same approach and keep trying to improve on the good, rather than only trying to fix the bad. Oh, I forgot to say, this is the second in a series, and if you haven't watched the first video on Original Sin 1, you should do that first. But perhaps I should have said that at the start of the video. I'm sure this is fine.